Hey, what's up, everyone? So this is going to be the 97th opening that I'd like to share with you, which is the Heath Bat opening. So it's just basically an extension of the Heath opening with longer line. So let's just quickly jump into the sequence: F5, F6, and then of course your usual diagonal to E6, D6, and then E7 is the start of the Heath opening. So we'll talk a little bit more about this extension, which is the usual and most popular book line for Heath Bat. So typically, when Heath is played, a white diagonal player most likely plays g5, otherwise f7, or if not f4. In fact, interestingly I see f7 being played more often than f4, given the fact that f7 would potentially create more tricky situations for both players. So I think f7 is a lot more useful. But of course, if you wanted to follow the strict book line, which I think most players do for the white diagonal, they would jump into g5. So basically, g5 is a horizontal cut connecting all the remaining discs that are spread out together into one. At the same time, you maintain this mini diagonal over here, so black doesn't have an easy cut back. Instead, black could potentially cut back to either g4 or g6, or in this case, similar to the typical head and tail theory that I like to preach about, is that g5 being the head of the entire row of this, and d5 over here being the tail end, and on the square on the tail end, you can then potentially find a quiet move that is a diagonal cut against the entire row or column of discs. So over here for c5, it's just a nice one disc flip diagonal cut, and that's basically the Heath Bat opening, or the start of the Heath Bat opening. So this particular disc that black has created for d6 is essentially to access f4. So interestingly, the best move that is recommended is either to prevent it by playing c7, so you remove the d7 disc, or to kind of ignore and play around it and play f7 and invite f4 followed by the follow up on the book response. So just comparing between c6 and f7, I would say most players go for the orthodox f7, so you can prepare f7 a little bit more. So when white plays this, on the tail end of it, f4 might be a good move. At the same time, using a head and tail theory, this being the head and this being the disc that it just flipped, and on the tail end of that disc flip, you can have c4 being the best move that is recommended. But still, as I mentioned over here, this opening opens up many options for both players. You can see that c4, c6, e3, f4, and g6 are pretty much all still open for contention and still within a playable kind of level or parameters. Within a ±4 or ±6 is something that is more playable if both players were of the same or similar level. So I would say that this opening is good when you are very sure that you have a stronger basic skill than your opponent, and you can lead him out of book, and you could potentially make more right moves than him or herself. So I would say that the typical Heath Bat sequence leads up to this sequence. So over here again, white can either play to e3 or f3 basically. After this shape has been established, the d6 disc still provide access to f4. So reason for e3 or f3 is basically to just kind of poison f4 for black. So let's just talk about the best line. Black still jumps in to regroup. Uh, Noticeably, the two discs, one disc that he flips is surrounded by all the existing discs after you place f4. At the same time, the other disc that black flips doesn't really create too many additional new moves for your opponent, still within that same region. So another playable move here is g6, but typically most players choose f4 for the fact that it's in the center 16 and it's a little bit more compact in the overall shape. So I would say the typical response goes in this sequence and then followed by g6 jumping in essentially. So yeah, in terms of this exchange, I would say it's quite typical, and even up till now, deep into the mid game, you can see for white um, or black, there are still many playable options. So black, you have c3. Over here, you even can choose e8, f8, and even two more moves on the side. So pretty much this opening gives up a lot of options. Of course, if you wanted to do some variation, you would have to give up a little bit of advantage. But in terms of a long thinking game, I would say this is very useful. In terms of a blitz game, maybe also useful as well, because it gives you a lot of options to play around. Like for example, taking c2 and controlling this mini diagonal momentarily just to create confusion. So I think that's essentially the main line for Heath bad. So another one that I've seen Akihiro kind of play this sequence is to play c6, interestingly. And of course, some other players also play this. So over here, you would have black's choice at c4 or e3 being the most common one. So over here, this I would say is also pretty common, even though white has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 playable options. But typically, white either plays c4, which is the book sequence, or d3, which is a nice variation to have potentially. So just kind of brings black over here, and then black would have to play more of a straight cut, and then up to this point. So this would be a typical variation. Or if white goes here, black jumps in, and then white cuts the silent move with a 1 this flip. Black also cuts back with a 1 this flip nestled in the entire group of this. So the interesting move over here is white essentially has to capture this to kind of give up the d3 move, kind of more like a feed and cross maneuver. So c3, d3, and then cross back into the center, and then followed by black having a couple of options to b4, b6, and g4 and g6. So I would say Heath is kind of useful in that sense. It gives you a lot of room to play with, and probably a lower probability of error. But interestingly, I find it actually quite difficult on the follow-up. So this, it's probably something worth exploring as a player playing black, and I recommend this for advanced players and above. If you're facing against white diagonal players, you can choose to explore this opening, and it gives you a lot of options, basically. So thank you very much for joining me, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.